In 1777, one of America's best generals did something almost no officer in history has ever done. He quit. Not because he was defeated, not because he was wounded, because Congress disrespected him. They promoted 5 officers over his head, men who had done less, risked less, and bled less than John Stark. So Stark went home. He walked away from the Continental Army, from the war, from everything he had fought for since Bunker Hill. And then the British invaded New Hampshire. Stark came back, but not on Congress's terms, on his own. He raised his own army, refused to answer to anyone outside New Hampshire, marched his men into Vermont without orders from a single Continental officer. And on August 16, 1777, he destroyed 1,000 of Burgoyne's best soldiers in a single afternoon. The victory that nobody ordered helped produce the surrender that nobody thought was possible. This is the story of the general who quit the revolution and came back to change it. This story is not about a battle. It is about what happens when an institution fails the people who built it, and what those people do next. John Stark did not quit the Continental Army because he was cowardly or disloyal or indifferent to the cause. He quit because the Continental Congress had demonstrated, through a specific and inexcusable act of political favoritism, that the meritocracy the revolution claimed to represent was not functioning. That the men with the right connections were being rewarded over the men who had actually done the fighting. And Stark had decided that he was not going to pretend otherwise. What makes his story different from every other tale of a disrespected officer is what happened after the resignation. Because Stark did not simply go home and wait for the war to find him. He went home and remained, privately, quietly, without announcement, the man he had always been. The man who had been forged in the forests of New Hampshire and who understood, when the moment came, exactly what needed to be done and exactly who was capable of doing it. The question this story keeps returning to is not whether Stark was right to quit. He was. The question is, what kind of man comes back after quitting? On his own terms, for his own reasons, refusing to accept the institutional authority that had failed him, and does the thing the institution could not do. Subscribe right now if you are not already here, because this is the story most accounts of Saratoga skip entirely. The battle that set up the battle that changed the war, and the general who fought it after walking away from everything. John Stark was born in 1728 in Londonderry, New Hampshire, the son of Scots-Irish immigrants who had carved a farm from the rocky New England wilderness. He grew up on the frontier, not the genteel frontier of prosperous colonial families with connections to London, but the actual frontier, the boundary between the settled world and the forest, where the settled world's rules did not fully apply, where survival required skills that no book could teach and no social position could substitute for. He was 19 years old when he was captured by the Abenaki during a hunting trip in 1752. The Abenaki were allied with the French, and Stark spent several months as their captive, an experience that would have broken men with less physical and psychological resilience. The Abenaki tested him repeatedly. They gave him a gauntlet to run, a line of warriors striking at a captive as he ran through, and Stark reportedly seized a pole from one of the warriors and used it to fight his way through, hitting back at the men who were hitting him. The Abenaki were apparently impressed enough to adopt him temporarily into their community rather than sell him to the French. He was ransomed eventually and returned to New Hampshire, but he carried 2 things back from that captivity that would define his entire military career. He carried an intimate knowledge of how Native American warriors moved through forest terrain, the patience, the silence, the ability to use the landscape itself as both cover and weapon. And he carried the lesson that the way to survive a gauntlet is not to run faster. It is to fight back. He joined Rogers Rangers in 1755 when the French and Indian War began, the most demanding light infantry unit in North America, a force that fought in the deep forest by Abenaki rules rather than European ones. Robert Rogers taught his men to move in small groups, use terrain instinctively, strike and withdraw before the enemy could organize a response, and never allow themselves to be fixed in a position where European linear tactics would destroy them. Stark was one of the best men Rogers ever had. He fought at the Battle on Snowshoes in 1758, one of the most brutal small-unit actions of the entire war, where Rogers' Rangers were ambushed in winter wilderness, and Stark helped organize the survivors into a fighting retreat that prevented the annihilation of the entire force. By the time the French and Indian War ended, John Stark had spent 8 years learning warfare in the most unforgiving classroom on the continent. He went back to New Hampshire. He built a sawmill. He raised a family. He became, by every outward appearance, a prosperous frontier farmer who had put his fighting years behind him. 19 years passed. Then came Lexington and Concord. Stark heard the news on April 19, 1775, the same day the shots were fired. By some accounts, he was plowing a field. By others, he was at his mill. What all the accounts agree on is that he left what he was doing immediately, rode to his neighbors to spread the word, and was marching toward Boston at the head of a company of New Hampshire men within hours. He was 46 years old. He was also, almost immediately, one of the best combat commanders in the colonial forces gathering around Boston. At the Battle of Bunker Hill on June 17, 1775, Stark commanded a regiment of New Hampshire men on the American left flank, positioned at a rail fence extending from the redoubt down toward the Mystic River. It was Stark who organized the positioning of the fence line, who directed his men to pile hay between the rails to break up the British line of sight, and who, according to accounts of the battle, placed a stake in the ground in front of his position and told his men not to fire until the British reached it. The British came in formation along the narrow beach at the base of the Mystic Bluffs, trying to flank the American position. Stark's regiment met them with disciplined volley fire at close range that shattered the formation completely. The British fell in rows. They reformed and tried again. Stark's men held. It was one of the most effective defensive actions of the entire battle, and one of the least celebrated, because the redoubt on Breed's Hill dominated the narrative both at the time and afterward. Stark fought at Trenton on Christmas night, 1776, crossing the Delaware with Washington and participating in the assault that saved the Revolution's momentum. He fought at Princeton in January 1777. By February of 1777, John Stark had 2 years of continuous service. He had fought at Bunker Hill, Trenton, and Princeton. He had built and trained regiments. He had proven himself, in the only way a soldier can prove himself, in the field under fire. And then Congress passed over him. In February of 1777, the Continental Congress promoted 5 new brigadier generals. None of them was John Stark. The 5 men promoted, Arthur St. Clair, Alexander McDougall, William Woodford, Anthony Wayne, and John Patterson, were not chosen purely on military merit. They were chosen through the political process by which the Continental Congress allocated rank, a process deeply influenced by which states had the most powerful delegations, which officers had the most influential advocates, and which men had the social connections that mattered in Philadelphia drawing rooms. Stark had none of those advantages. He was a New Hampshire farmer. He had no family connections, no political patrons, no wealthy friends with congressional access. He had military merit and nothing else to offer. Military merit, apparently, was not enough. He wrote a letter of resignation. It was blunt, direct, and unapologetic, entirely consistent with the man who had fought his way through an Abenaki gauntlet rather than simply run. He stated his reasons. He made no plea. He did not ask to be reconsidered. He resigned. Washington, understanding what the army was losing, tried to persuade him to stay. Stark liked Washington. He respected Washington. He did not budge. He went home to New Hampshire, and to his mills and his farms, and the life he had left behind 2 years earlier. And there he waited. Not passively, not bitterly. He did not spend those months writing angry letters to newspapers or lobbying friends to restore his commission. He simply returned to being the man he had always been, a frontier farmer who knew the forests and the rivers and the people of New Hampshire the way Marion knew the South Carolina swamps, a man whose community was his context and whose values were not dependent on any institution's validation of them. He waited. The institution that had failed him was about to need him again. To understand why Stark's return mattered so much, you have to understand what was moving toward New Hampshire in the summer of 1777. General John Burgoyne had assembled an army of nearly 8,000 British regulars, German mercenaries, Loyalist militia, and Native American allies in Canada, and was marching south with a plan to split the colonies in two. His route ran south through Lake Champlain to Albany, following the classic invasion corridor of the Hudson Valley. Burgoyne was 54 years old, a decorated veteran, a member of Parliament, and a man of considerable personal charm who had lobbied hard for this command and who had presented his invasion plan directly to King George III. He was confident, well supplied, and in command of the most formidable British force assembled in North America since the 7 Years' War. He was also, in ways he had not yet discovered, marching into a campaign that would expose every vulnerability in his planning. The plan required 3 things to happen simultaneously: his own force moving south from Canada, General Howe pushing north from New York City, and Colonel St. Leger sweeping east through the Mohawk Valley, all 3 converging on Albany. Any one of them failing would leave Burgoyne dangerously exposed. Howe, as we have seen, decided to sail south to Philadelphia instead. St. Leger was stopped at Fort Stanwix and eventually routed. But in the summer of 1777, Burgoyne did not yet know any of this. He was advancing with the confidence of a man whose plan looked perfect on paper, whose army had just captured Fort Ticonderoga virtually without resistance, and whose enemy appeared to be in full retreat before him. He needed supplies. His long supply line back to Canada was already straining. He needed horses to pull his artillery, more than 130 cannons, and to carry his enormous baggage train. He decided to send a raiding force into Vermont. The British raid toward Bennington was organized and led by Lieutenant Colonel Friedrich Baum, a German officer commanding roughly 700 men, mostly German dragoons and Loyalist militia, with a small contingent of Canadians and Native American warriors. Baum's intelligence, provided by Loyalist informants who badly overestimated the loyalty of the Vermont population, suggested the area around Bennington was lightly defended and populated by Loyalist sympathizers who might even actively support the British. Both pieces of intelligence were wrong. What Baum did not know was that New Hampshire had a militia general who had come home in disgust 6 months earlier and had been waiting for exactly this moment. When word reached Concord, New Hampshire, that a British raiding force was moving toward Bennington, the New Hampshire legislature turned to the one man they trusted to respond. They asked John Stark to command the New Hampshire militia. Stark accepted. But on one condition: he would answer to the New Hampshire legislature. He would not answer to the Continental Congress, the Continental Army, or any Continental officer who tried to place him under their authority. He was not rejoining the institution that had failed him. He was serving his state, on his terms, with his own commission and his own authority. The Continental Congress and the Continental Army, whose General Benjamin Lincoln tried to assert authority over Stark's force almost immediately, were furious. Stark did not care. He had spent his entire life proving that the right man in the right place, with the right knowledge, was more valuable than any title or commission. He was not going to let institutional politics prevent him from doing what he had come back to do. He raised approximately 1,500 New Hampshire militia in a matter of days. These were not green recruits. They were New England men who had been watching the British invade their region with the particular fury of people who understood that the invader was coming for them specifically. They were farmers and hunters who knew the terrain, who had their own muskets and their own motivations, and who needed a commander they trusted. They had one. Stark marched them south into Vermont to find Baum before Baum found Bennington. The battle came on August 16, 1777. Baum had positioned his force on a wooded hilltop overlooking the Walloomsac River, a position he had chosen for its defensibility, a position that made sense for a professional European officer trained to hold ground. It made no sense against what was coming for him. Stark organized his attack with the tactical intelligence of a man who had spent 8 years learning to fight in the forests of New England against opponents who used terrain as a weapon. He sent flanking parties around both sides of the German position through the woods, working through terrain that Baum's men, dragoons trained for open-ground cavalry operations, could neither observe nor effectively defend. The frontal assault was the diversion. The flanking movements were the battle. Before the attack, Stark reportedly pointed at the German position and told his men, "There are the redcoats, and they will be ours, or this night, Molly Stark sleeps a widow." It was not a strategic assessment. It was a statement of intent from a man who had decided that today was the day, and that there was nothing left to calculate. His men attacked from multiple directions simultaneously in the early afternoon. The battle was ferocious. Baum's professional soldiers fought hard. They had bayonets and discipline and a fortified position, but Stark's men had numbers, surprise, local terrain knowledge, and the absolute fury of people defending their own ground. Baum was mortally wounded in the fighting. His force collapsed. When a British relief column of another 700 men under Colonel Heinrich von Breyman arrived later that afternoon, marching to reinforce what they expected to be a successful German garrison, they found instead a battlefield littered with Baum's casualties and Stark's militia, flushed with victory and ready to fight again. Colonel Seth Warner and the Green Mountain Boys arrived at almost exactly the right moment to reinforce Stark's exhausted men. Together they smashed Breyman's relief column as well. By sunset, Burgoyne had lost nearly 1,000 men, killed, wounded, or captured. 1/8 of his entire invasion force, gone in a single afternoon. He had gained nothing, not a horse, not a barrel of flour, not a wagon of supplies. The first major crack in the foundation of his entire campaign had appeared. And the man who created it had done so without a Continental Commission, without orders from any Continental officer, and in direct defiance of the institutional authority that had tried to subordinate his command. Bennington did not win the Saratoga Campaign. It did something more important. It changed the conditions in which the Saratoga Campaign would be decided. Burgoyne continued south after Bennington, but the loss of nearly 1,000 men, particularly the loss of officers with experience and the horses and supplies he had sent Baum to capture, had fundamentally weakened his position. His supply line was increasingly strained. His Native American allies, reading the outcome of Bennington, began quietly disappearing. The loyalist population he had counted on to sustain his advance turned out to be far less numerous and far less willing to show themselves than his intelligence had suggested. And the news of Bennington spread. Militia flooded toward the American forces blocking Burgoyne's path south. Men who had been hesitating about which side to support watched what a New Hampshire farmer with a militia force had done to professional German soldiers and made their calculations accordingly. The surge in American recruitment that followed Bennington was one of the factors that gave Horatio Gates the numerical superiority he would eventually use at Saratoga. Burgoyne's army crossed the Hudson River in mid-September, dug in at Bemis Heights, fought the two battles of Saratoga against an American force that had been swelled by militia volunteers, and surrendered on October 17th. The chain that ran from Bennington to Saratoga, to the French alliance, to Yorktown and American independence is not a straight line. Many things had to go right, and many things had to go wrong for the full consequence to unfold. But Bennington was where the chain began to weaken Burgoyne, in the ways that Saratoga would finally break him. Stark did not set that chain in motion by following orders. He set it in motion by coming home, raising an army, and refusing to fight any way except his own. Congress eventually came around. On October 4, 1777, less than 2 months after Bennington, the Continental Congress voted to grant John Stark a commission as Brigadier General in the Continental Army, with the date backdated to account for the promotion he had been denied in February. It was the right decision, made 18 months too late. Stark accepted the commission without making a scene about the delay. He was not a man who needed vindication from the institution that had failed him. He had already demonstrated what he needed to demonstrate on a hillside in Vermont without their permission. He served until the end of the war, commanding forces in various capacities, never again reaching the specific moment of clarity and fury that had produced Bennington. He was an effective officer, but never again quite the force of nature he had been on August 16, 1777. The antagonist, Burgoyne, spent the rest of the war trying to explain what had gone wrong. He blamed his subordinates, his superiors, the logistics, the wilderness, the weather. He blamed everyone except the institution that had produced the specific failure at Bennington, an intelligence apparatus that told him the Vermont countryside was loyal, and a strategic plan that assumed 3 separate converging columns would somehow coordinate their movements across hundreds of miles of wilderness without any of them failing. He never blamed himself for the overconfidence that had sent Baum into country he did not know, with instructions that assumed cooperation he would not find. Stark outlived almost everyone. He died in 1822 at the age of 93, the last surviving general of the American Revolution. In the months before his death, a veterans' reunion was organized in New Hampshire, and Stark, too old and frail to travel, sent a toast to be read in his absence. The toast was 5 words: "Live free or die." It became the state motto of New Hampshire. The man who had quit the revolution rather than accept its failures, who had come back on his own terms to fight the battle that helped save it, who had spent the last 45 years of his life as a prosperous New England farmer, while the country he helped create grew into something neither he nor anyone else could have fully imagined. That man, in 5 words, captured something about the American character that all the speeches and pamphlets and declarations of the Revolution had been reaching for. Not the freedom the institution grants you, the freedom you refuse to surrender even when the institution fails you. The question this story keeps raising is deceptively simple. What should John Stark have done in February of 1777? The conventional answer, the answer that most military history would offer, is that he should have stayed, that the cause was larger than his pride, that the correct response to institutional injustice is to work within the institution to change it, not to walk away and let your absence deprive the cause of your talent. That answer is not wrong, but it also misses something. Stark came back. He came back stronger, clearer, and more effective than he would have been if he had stayed and spent 6 months quietly furious about a commission he had not received. He came back on terms that let him act without the political interference that had hampered him inside the Continental Army. He came back in exactly the right moment, in exactly the right place, for exactly the right fight. And he won it. Maybe the question is not whether he was right to quit. Maybe the question is whether the institution that drove him away learned anything from what he did when he was gone. Drop a comment below. If Stark had stayed, swallowed the insult, accepted the promotion he did not receive, does Bennington still happen? Does anyone else see what he saw, respond the way he responded, and win in the way he won? I am not sure the answer is yes. If this story changed how you think about the relationship between individuals and the institutions that fail them, share it. Not for the channel, for the idea. Subscribe if you are not already here, because next time we are covering another man who was failed by his institution, who made a different choice than Stark, and whose story ended in a way that no one who knew him in 1775 could have predicted. The hillside is just where this one happened,